That mountain man would refuse the Queen of England if she rode up his pass in a coach drawn by 6 white horses. He has refused every other woman in this county. He will refuse her too. The woman who said it was Iris Marchand, who kept the post and telegraph office at the front of the dry goods store in Cedar Falls, Idaho Territory, in the autumn of 1885. She said it across her counter at 4:30 in the afternoon on a Tuesday to a small clutch of 3 other women in shawls who had come in for letters and had stayed for talk. The 4 women all knew exactly who Iris Marchand meant. The mountain man was Silas Greer. He had been on the ridge above Cedar Falls for 9 years. The county had, in those 9 years, sent 11 women up the South Road to his gate. 2 milliners' daughters from Boise, 3 widows from Lewiston, a schoolteacher from Spokane Falls, a Pinkerton clerk's sister from Sandpoint, a Methodist preacher's niece from Wallace, a dance hall owner from Murray who had reformed and had come west looking for a quiet husband, and the schoolmistress of Cedar Falls itself, who had ridden up alone in a smart green coat and a wide-brimmed hat with 3 feathers in it, and had ridden down again at sundown without having said a word about what had passed at the gate. He had refused all 11. The town did not know how he had refused them, because none of them had ever said. The town knew only that they had come down. The town had stopped sending, by mutual quiet agreement of the women of the Ladies' Reading Circle 2 summers ago. The line about the Queen of England was, by the autumn of 1885, no longer a line that needed to be argued. It was a line that was now a kind of small local proverb. It was a line that had passed, in the way town lines pass, from kitchen to kitchen and pew to pew, until it had become the thing one woman said to her when a new widow or a new spinster moved into Cedar Falls, and someone somewhere suggested in a whisper that perhaps she should ride up the South Road. The woman about whom Iris Marchand had just said, the line was not in fact a new widow or a new spinster. She was a woman who had been in Cedar Falls for 2 years, and who had not, in those 2 years, ridden up any road of any direction, with any intention of marrying anyone. Her name was Hannah Cole. She was 36 years old. She had been a healer in this town since the spring of 1884. She had a 6-year-old daughter named Ruth. She had buried her husband, John Cole, of cholera, in the summer of 1883. In a small church plot outside the town of Helena, Montana, before she had taken the daughter and the medicine satchel and the few small things she had been able to load into a wagon, and had ridden west. She had not heard the line Iris Marchand spoke that afternoon. She had been at home in her cabin on the north end of Cedar Falls, putting up the last of the autumn yarrow into small brown paper twists for winter use. The 4 women at the counter would not have meant her to hear. The 4 women at the counter would have, if pressed, said the line was kindly meant. The 4 women at the counter would have said, in the way town women say such things, that they were only trying to spare the widow Cole the embarrassment of a refusal that no woman in this county had ever yet not received. But the woman at the back of the dry goods store, the woman the 4 women at the counter had not noticed, was the one Iris Marchand should have noticed. The woman at the back of the dry goods store was Ruth Cole, 6 years old, in a small brown coat standing behind the barrel of dried apples, holding in her small mittened hand a single peppermint stick she had been told to pick out herself. She had been listening with both her small ears. She did not say a word. She paid for the peppermint at the counter. When her turn came, she walked out the door of the dry goods store. She walked the 4 blocks home to her mother's cabin in the cold blue afternoon. She did not eat the peppermint. She put it in her coat pocket. She did not tell her mother what she had heard at the counter. She did not tell her mother for 2 weeks. She told her mother, in fact, only on the night her mother sat at her bedside with a wet cloth across her forehead at 1 in the morning with a fever of 103.7, and her mother said, "Lo, Ruth, sweetness, the doctor will not come for us. I have been to his door. I will need to go for help. I will need to go to a place I have never been." Ruth Cole opened her small, hot eyes. She said in a small, dry voice, "Go to the mountain man, Mama, the one on the ridge. Iris Marchand at the post said he would refuse a queen, but you are not a queen. You are my mama." Hannah Cole did not say anything for one long second. Then she stood up from the bed. She kissed her daughter's forehead. She wrapped her gray wool shawl around her shoulders. She picked up the medicine bag that had not, by anyone in this town, ever been carried by anyone but her. She lit the lantern at the front door. She stepped out into the autumn dark. She walked south up the road that led to the south ridge of Cedar Falls. She had never walked it before. She did not know how long it would take her. She knew only that she had eaten the kind of pride a widow eats in the last hour of a sick child's worst night, and that she had nothing now to lose by knocking on a door that, by every account in town, would not open. She did not know that the man inside the cabin on the South Ridge had, that very evening, been thinking about his own life in the quiet, desperate way Henry David Thoreau in 1854 had named in a book Silas Greer had read 3 times. The mass of men, Thoreau had written, lead lives of quiet desperation. What is called resignation is confirmed desperation. Silas Greer had underlined those words in his own copy of the book the year he had moved to Cedar Falls, and he had not, until that night, found a reason to unmark them. The reason was about to knock at his door. Hannah Cole had been 22 when she married John Cole in a small Methodist chapel in St. Joseph, Missouri, on a clear Saturday in the autumn of 1871. She had been the only daughter of a wheat farmer from Iowa, raised among 4 older brothers, taught the herbs and the catching of foals, and the simple suturing of cuts by her mother, who had been a country midwife on the side. She had been a strong, slow, careful girl, the kind of girl whose body had grown big at 13 and had stayed big through her 16th and 20th and 22nd birthdays in a household where the men ate seconds and a woman with small wrists was a curiosity. She had been called Big Hannah by her brothers, kindly, and Plump Hannah by an aunt from St. Louis, unkindly. She had answered to neither. She had answered to Hannah, the name her father had given her on the day she was born, the name she had carried into a marriage and a widowhood, and into the small frontier town of Cedar Falls, Idaho. John Cole had been 27 when he married her. He had been a freight wagon driver for the Wells Fargo line. He had been a tall, sandy-haired man with a slow laugh and the habit of folding the corners of the letters he wrote her into small, careful triangles. He had courted her over the course of 2 summers between freight runs, with 7 letters and 3 Sunday visits. He had asked her to marry him in her father's kitchen with his hat in his hand and his eyes on the table. They had married. They had moved to Helena, Montana, in 1875 because John Cole's company had moved their hub west. They had buried 2 babies in 3 years before Ruth had been born in the spring of 1879. Ruth had been the 3rd try. Ruth had lived. Hannah had decided in the small Methodist cemetery on the south slope of Helena, the morning she had buried the 2nd baby, that she would never be the mother of a child she did not see grow. That promise had held. Ruth was 6½ years old in the autumn of 1885. She had been raised on a steady plain diet of beans and bread, and the kind of close, watchful mother love a woman gives when she has buried 2 children in the same plot before that child was born. She read. She wrote. She did her sums. She helped her mother sort the dried herbs into the small brown paper twists. She knew the names of 44 plants by their leaves alone. She was, by the standards of small frontier daughters, an unusually quiet and unusually clever child. She was, by the standards of her mother, the reason the sun came up. John Cole had died of cholera in the small Wells Fargo Company hospital in Helena in the summer of 1883. He had come back from a run with a fever. He had been in the hospital for 3 days. He had not come out. Hannah had buried him beside the two stillborn babies and a small slate marker that her brother had carried up from Iowa the year before. She had been 34. Ruth had been 4. She had stayed in Helena one more year. She had not been able to stay longer. The cabin where she had lived with John had begun, by the second autumn, to feel like a house with a fourth person missing from the table. She had loaded the wagon. She had ridden west. She had reached Cedar Falls in the spring of 1884 because the town had advertised in the Helena paper for a midwife. The previous midwife, an Irish woman named Mary Donovan, had died of pneumonia in the February of that year. The town had not had anyone to catch a baby in 3 months. Hannah Cole had set up her cabin on the north end of town. She had hung her shingle. She had begun her practice. She had caught 27 babies in 18 months. She had buried 1 mother and 3 babies, which was, by the rough arithmetic of the frontier, a count she could carry. She had not lost a mother she might have saved with better hands. She had lost 1 mother she could not have saved with the hands of Christ himself. Dr. Albert Hollingsworth, the town doctor of Cedar Falls, had not welcomed her. He had been the only physician in the county for 6 years before she had come. He had built his practice on a tight system of payment and credit that depended on the women of the town having no other place to go. He had not refused her openly. He had refused her quietly. He had told the wife of the mayor, at a Christmas party in the December of her first year, that the new midwife was a fine woman in her place, but that her place was small. The mayor's wife had reported the comment to 2 other women. The 2 other women had reported it to 4. The doctor had not denied it when asked. The town had absorbed the comment the way frontier towns absorb such comments. Some women had nodded. Some women had not. Some women, the ones who had been caught by Hannah, had quietly stopped going to the doctor at all. That was the woman who had come to the doctor's door at 11:30 the night before, with a child running a fever of 103. That was the woman who had been told by the doctor's housekeeper through a chained door that the doctor was at a card game in Lewiston and was not expected back until Thursday. That was the woman who had walked home through the cold autumn dark, with the fever cloth still warm in her own apron pocket. That was the woman who had sat at her child's bedside through the small hours of the morning, and through the next day, and through the next night, and who had at last, at 1 in the morning of the second night, when the fever had climbed to 103.7 and the small body had begun to convulse for the first time, looked up at her daughter and asked the question to which her daughter had answered, "Go to the mountain man." Hannah Cole had been a widow for 2 years and 2 months. She had not in those 2 years and 2 months looked at any man in any town with the eye of a woman who looks. She had not had the time. She had not had the willingness. She had not had the body, in her own estimation, for it. She had let the women of Cedar Falls call her the Widow Cole, and she had let them think of her as the kind of widow who would always be a widow, and she had not corrected them. But she walked, that night, up the south road toward the cabin of the man who had refused 11 women in 9 years. She walked it because her daughter was in a bed running a fever the doctor had refused to look at. She walked it because she had nothing else to walk to. She walked it because a 6-year-old girl had told her, with eyes hot from fever, that the man on the ridge had refused a queen, but that she was not a queen, she was a mama. She walked it with the medicine bag on her shoulder and the lantern in her hand, and the cold autumn moon on the snow that had begun, that very night, to fall for the first time of the season. Silas Greer had been 26 when he came home from the war in the summer of 1865, to find that the house he had been writing letters to for 3 years no longer had inside it any of the people he had been writing to. His mother had died of consumption in the spring of 1863. His younger sister Margaret, who had been 15 when he left, had died of the same in the autumn of 1864. His father, a Vermont cooper who had stood at the kitchen table the morning Silas left and had said only, "Come home, son," had been buried, with both of them, in the small congregational cemetery at the edge of the village of Fairley in the January of 1865. He had not been ill. The neighbor who told Silas the story said the father had simply, after the sister's funeral, gone to bed for the winter and had not gotten up. The doctor had called it a heart that had failed for no medical reason. The neighbor had called it something else. Silas had stood at the 3 graves on a Tuesday morning in July. He had not cried. He had been a man who had not cried in 3 years of war, and who had not learned how to cry in any short time after. He had walked back to the empty house. He had slept that first night in his sister's small room, in her small bed, because his own bed and his parents' bed had been moved out and burned, in the way the cabins of consumption dead were treated in that part of Vermont. The sister's bed had not been burned because she had not died in it. She had died at her aunt's house in Burlington, where she had been sent for what the family had thought was the cleaner air. He had lived in the empty house for 1 year. He had taken on his father's cooperage. He had married a woman named Catherine Pratt, who had been the daughter of the village blacksmith, and who had been a friend of his sister's. Catherine had been 23. He had been 27. They had married in the same congregational church where his family was buried in the September of 1866. Catherine had not been a happy bride. She had not been an unhappy bride either. She had been a careful bride, the kind of bride who had married a man because the village had thought it suitable, who had moved into his empty house, who had cooked the meals and washed the linen and slept in the new bed they had ordered from Boston, and who had told him, at the end of 3 years, that she was going to her sister's in New Hampshire and that she would not be coming back. She had taken with her, when she went, the small carved walnut box that had held his mother's wedding ring and his sister's small silver locket. She had taken the box because, she had said in the note she had left on the kitchen table, she had not known what else to take that would have made him understand. She had taken the box because she had wanted him, when he came home that evening, to look on the shelf where the box had been, and to know that the empty space on the shelf was the shape of the marriage he had given her. He had read the note. He had looked at the shelf. He had understood. He had not gone after her. He had not written to her. He had not, in the 15 years since, said her name aloud to any person in any town. He had stayed in the village of Fairley 1 more year. He had finished out the contracts of the cooperage. He had sold the house. He had taken the money. He had bought a wagon and a team of mules. He had loaded the wagon with the books from his father's small library, and the bench his father had built, and the small carved walnut box he had bought at a Boston shop to replace the one Catherine had taken, which he had filled with his own father's pocket watch, and a lock of his sister's hair he had cut from her body at the funeral. He had ridden west. He had taken 9 years to reach the high country of Idaho Territory. He had stopped in St. Louis. He had stopped in Denver. He had stopped in Salt Lake. He had built cabins in 3 towns before Cedar Falls and had not been able to stay in any of them because the towns had all, sooner or later, sent up a woman to his door. The sending of women was, in Silas Greer's experience of the West, the universal habit of all small towns toward all single men of 40. He had refused them all. He had refused them all the same way. He had opened the door. He had taken off his hat. He had said, "Mom, I am honored. I am not in the market. I will not be in the market. I am sorry for the ride you have taken. There is hot coffee on the stove if you would care to come in. If you would not, I will saddle a fresh horse and ride beside you back to the foot of the road for your safety, and we will not speak of this in the town again." The 11 women who had been sent up to the south ridge of Cedar Falls between 1879 and 1883 had all received this speech. 2 of them had come in for coffee. 9 of them had not. All of them had ridden back down. None of them had ever said, in any account that reached Silas's ears, the words he had spoken to them, because the words had not been words a woman could repeat in a parlor without admitting the kind of ride she had been on. The line about the Queen of England had been said about him so many times that he had heard it twice himself, once from a freighter at the smithy and once from the cooper in Wallace, who supplied his iron. He had not minded the line. He had thought, in fact, that the line did the work for him. He had reached, by the autumn of 1885, the long, quiet shape of life he had set out to reach when he had ridden west from Fairleigh in 1870. He had a cabin on a south-facing ridge with a view of the Bitterroot Range to the east. He had a herd of 40 sheep that he ran with a single small black dog. He had a small library of 172 books on a shelf his father had built. He had the small carved walnut box on the shelf above the stove. He had no neighbor closer than 4 miles. He had not been ill in 9 years. He had not been lonely in 7, because he had told himself he had stopped feeling the difference between loneliness and quiet at some point in his 5th year on the ridge. He had been wrong about that, and he had known he had been wrong for the last 6 months. He had not told himself the truth about it. He had been in the habit of not telling himself such truths. That was the man sitting that autumn night by the stove of his cabin on the south ridge above Cedar Falls, with the small black dog asleep at his feet, and a book of Emerson open on his knee and a kettle on the iron, when a knock came at his door at 20 minutes past 2 in the morning. He had not been asleep. He had been reading the same sentence in Emerson for the 3rd time without taking it in. The sentence was the one he had underlined in pencil 4 winters before. Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. He set the book down. He stood up. He picked up the lantern from the hook by the door. He thought, in the moment between hearing the knock and putting his hand on the door, that this would be the 12th. He opened the door. He saw in the small yellow circle of his lantern a woman in a wine-red shawl over a brown wool dress, holding a leather medicine bag with both hands at the level of her waist, her face plain and tired, her hair pulled back into a low practical knot at the nape of her neck, her shoulders broad and her body broad, and her brown eyes lifted up to his own without coyness and without apology. He saw at her elbow no horse. He saw at her elbow a lantern hanging from her left wrist. She had walked the 5 miles in. She did not say, "Good evening, Mr. Greer," and she did not say, "I am sorry to wake you." And she did not say any of the 11 other openings he had heard at this door across the years. She said, in a steady low voice that had a faint flat northern Iowa in it, "Mr. Greer, my name is Hannah Cole. I am a widow. I am the midwife on the north end of Cedar Falls. I am not here for any reason that has to do with you. My daughter has been sick for 2 days, and the doctor will not come. I am here because I have walked 5 miles in the cold, and I have nowhere else to walk to. I am here because I need a stronger hand than my own at her bedside before the sun comes up. I am asking you, plain, if you would put on your boots and your coat and ride down the south road with me on the 2nd horse I do not have to my cabin. I will pay you in dried herbs and in poultices, and in any work my hands can do for yours through the winter. I am not here for any other reason. I will go back down alone if you say no. I would rather not." Silas Greer stood at his open door. The wind from the south came around her shawl. He did not for 1 second take his eyes off her face. He had not been asked in 9 years by any woman who had come to this door for anything other than himself. He said, "Mom." She said, "Mr. Greer." He said, "Come in, sit by the stove. I will be saddled in 10 minutes. She came in. He shut the door behind her. That, by the count of Silas Greer and Hannah Cole in the years to follow, was the first of the 5 promises. He saddled the larger of his 2 horses, the bay mare he kept for winter travel, and the second smaller gelding for her. She had not ridden much in her life. He helped her up. She sat the gelding with the broad, steady seat of a woman who had ridden farm wagons since she was a girl, and who could keep her weight balanced over a horse's spine, because she had been balancing her own weight over wooden floors for 36 years. Rode down the south road through the new fall snow. The moon had come up. The snow was light on the road, and the road was good for the horses. He did not say a word for the first mile. She did not say a word either. In the second mile he said low, "Tell me what she has." She said fever. Came up 2 evenings ago after a cold. She had been fighting for a week. She has had croup 3 times in her life. This one is in her chest. Not yet pneumonia. Close to it. Pulse 110 this evening. Temperature 103.7 at the worst hour. I have been steaming her with eucalyptus and pine. I have been bathing her in cool cloths. I have given willow tea. The fever has not broken. He said, "What you need from me?" She said, "Hands." 2 more steady hands. I cannot bathe her and steam her and listen to her chest at the same time. The doctor would have brought carbolic and a chest stethoscope. The doctor is in Lewiston playing cards. I am asking the man who is here. He nodded. He did not say anything else for the rest of the ride. They reached her cabin at the north end of Cedar Falls at 3:30 in the morning. The lantern she had left burning in her front window was still burning. She had not, in her hurry, banked the stove. The stove had gone low. The cabin was colder than she would have wanted. She slid down off the gelding. She tied the reins to her own rail. She went in. He tied his mare and followed. The small bedroom at the back of the cabin held a single bed and a chair. The bed held Ruth Cole. Ruth Cole was small and pale under a brown quilt. Her face was the color of the bone china teacup on the bedside table. Her hair was wet on the pillow. Hannah Cole knelt beside the bed. She put her palm on her daughter's forehead. She felt the heat. She felt the pulse at the small throat. She bent her ear to the small chest, and she listened. She lifted her face. She said, "Mr. Greer, carbolic and water on the back of the stove. I need a steam tent. I need a kettle full of boiling water. I need the small jar of eucalyptus on the second shelf of the cupboard. I need fresh, cool cloths from the basin in the kitchen. I need you to keep the fire high." "Do you cook?" he said. "Some enough. Make broth, beef bones in the cellar in a small crock, onion in the bin, salt on the shelf. Slow boil. We will need it when she comes up." "Yes, ma'am." He worked. He did not ask a second question. He did not interrupt her. He did not at any point in the next 4 hours refer to himself. By 6 in the morning, the steam tent was working over the bed. The small chest was clearing. The fever had come down to 101.8 by Hannah's count and to 101.4 by her thermometer. The small Becton Dickinson glass thermometer she had brought west from Helena in a velvet case. The child was breathing easier. The child had not woken, but the child was breathing as a child breathes who has decided to live the next day. Hannah Cole sat back in the chair beside the bed. She set her palms flat on her thighs. She breathed. Silas Greer stood in the doorway of the small bedroom. He had been making the broth. He had a wooden spoon in one hand. He said, "Low." "Ma'am," she said. "Mr. Greer," he said, "she will live, she will. You are sure?" "I am sure enough that I will sleep for 1 hour in this chair. If you would sit with her for that hour." "I will not be longer than that," he said. "I will sit," she said. "Mr. Greer." "Ma'am." "Hannah." He looked at her. He did not say her name. He nodded once. He came into the room. He set the wooden spoon down on the bedside table. He sat down on the floor beside the chair, his back against the wall, his long legs out in front of him, his right hand on the bed rail near the small foot of the child. She closed her eyes. She slept for 1 hour. When she woke, the child was awake. The child was looking at her. The child's eyes had the clear, true look of a child whose fever had broken in the night, and who was, for the first time in 2 days, herself. The child said in a small, dry voice, "Mama." Hannah Cole said, "I am here, sweetness." The child looked past her mother. The child looked at the man on the floor beside the chair. The child said in the same small, dry voice, "Is that the mountain man?" Hannah Cole did not look at Silas Greer. She said, "Yes, sweetness, that is him. His name is Mr. Greer. He came down with me from the South Ridge. He has been making you broth." The child looked at Silas Greer. The child looked at him for a long second. Then she said, "Mr. Greer." He said, "Yes, child." She said, "I am sorry I called you the one who would refuse a queen." He looked at her. He did not say anything for a moment. He said, "Child, you may call me that. It will not have been wrong. Will you take a cup of broth now?" She nodded. He stood up off the floor. He went out to the kitchen. He came back with a tin cup. He helped her sit up against the pillow. He held the cup to her lips. She drank. She drank slow. She drank until the cup was empty. She lay back down. She closed her eyes. She said before she slept, "Mr. Greer." He said, "Yes, child." She said, "Mama said you have hands stronger than hers." I think she was right. She slept. Silas Greer stood beside the bed for a long moment. He did not look at Hannah Cole. He looked at the small face of the child on the pillow. He set the empty tin cup slow on the bedside table beside the thermometer in its velvet case. Then he said, in a voice he had not used in 15 years, "Hannah," she said, "Silas," he said, "I will stay until she is on her feet. I will sleep on the floor by the stove. I will leave when she does not need me. I will not, while I am here, presume on you. I will not, when I leave, pretend I was not here," she said. "Silas, that is more of a thing to say than I asked you to say. You may stay. We will not speak of any other thing until the child is up." He nodded. He went back out to the kitchen. He banked the stove. He poured a cup of broth for himself. He sat down at her small kitchen table with the cup in both his hands. He looked for the first time in 9 years at a kitchen table that was not his own. That was the second promise, by the count he would later keep. The first had been at the door of his cabin. "I will go with you." The second had been at her kitchen table. "I will not pretend I was not here." The third would come on the fourth morning, when Ruth Cole sat up in bed and asked him whether he would teach her the name of every plant on the second shelf of her mother's cupboard. He had taught her. He had known every name. Hannah had been at the kitchen door with her hand on the frame and her eyes on the man kneeling on the bedroom floor beside her daughter's bed. The fourth would come on the 7th evening, when he sat at her kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood and said, "Hannah, I am going back up the ridge in the morning. If you would, I would have you and the child come up next Sunday for dinner. I would have you see the cabin. I would have you decide if the cabin is a thing you might come up to often." The fifth would not come for 2 more weeks, on the day of the first real snow of November, when Silas Greer rode down the South Road into the front of the dry goods store of Cedar Falls in his Sunday coat, and walked up to the counter where Iris Marchand stood sorting mail, and said, in the low voice he used at his cabin door, "Iris, I have come for the post. And I have come while I am here to tell you that the line about the Queen of England will need to be retired in the parlors of this town. There has now been a woman who has come up the South Road, and to whom I have not said no. I would prefer the news of that come from me first, before it comes from anyone else's window. Good morning, Mom." He had tipped his hat. He had taken his mail, he had walked out the door, he had ridden, slow, the 4 blocks to the cabin on the north end of town. He had not knocked at the door of that cabin, he had not needed to. The door of that cabin had been opening for him every morning of the previous 19 days. Since the morning he had carried the small girl Ruth Cole on his own shoulders out to the front porch to see her first sunrise after the fever, with her mother walking beside them, holding the medicine bag in her own hand. But this morning he had knocked. He had knocked because the 5th promise required, by his own private rule, the formal knock of a man who had come to ask the question that the previous 4 promises had been clearing the way for. Hannah Cole had opened the door. He had said, "Hannah." She had said, "Silas." He had said, "Will you come up the ridge with me? Not for a Sunday, for the rest of the autumns and winters and springs and summers I have left in me on this ridge. Will you bring the child? Will you bring the bag? Will you bring the books you have not yet brought up? Will you let me build a second room onto the cabin for the bag and the books, and a small bed for the child? Will you marry me Hannah Cole in any chapel of any town in this county that you will name?" She had not said anything for a long second. She had looked at the small black dog at his boot. She had looked at the bay mare at her rail. She had looked at the snow on the brim of his hat. She had said, "Silas." He had said, "Yes." She had said, "I will." That was the fifth promise. That was the promise neither of them could have spoken on the night of the knock at his door. That was the promise the small, dry voice of Ruth Cole had set in motion when she had said to her sick mother, at 1 in the morning of a fever night, "Go to the mountain man, Mama. He refuses queens. You are not a queen." The lantern in the kitchen of the cabin on the north end of Cedar Falls burned. That morning, the way lanterns burn in kitchens, where two people who have not been at a kitchen table in a long time have decided, against the long odds of their own widowhoods, to put 2 chairs back at the table. The first week Silas Greer slept on the floor by the stove of Hannah Cole's cabin was the first week he had slept under another roof in 9 years. He did not sleep well the first night. He did not sleep at all the second. He slept 4 hours the third. By the fourth night he had built a small frame of pine on the kitchen floor in the corner, where the wood box used to sit, and he had laid the wood box outside on the porch, where it could sit through the winter, and he had brought down from his cabin on the ridge the wool mattress from his own bed, and he had laid the mattress on the frame, and he had slept the sleep of a man who has decided he will not, after all, be sleeping under his own roof for the next 10 or 15 years. He slept on that small frame in the corner of the kitchen until the morning he and Hannah Cole and Ruth Cole moved together up to the ridge cabin on a Saturday in the 3rd week of November. The thing he did during the days of that first week was the second promise. It was a small thing. It was the kind of small thing a town does not notice, and the kind of small thing a woman never forgets. The bag. The medicine bag. Hannah Cole had been carrying the bag for 2 years in Cedar Falls, and for 2 years in Helena before that. The bag had been on her shoulder for, by her own rough count, 3,000 miles in 4 years. On the morning of the second day, when Hannah went out to the front porch to leave for a call at the McKinley cabin on the West Road, Silas Greer met her at the door, with her coat in one hand and the bag in his other. He helped her into the coat. He did not give her the bag. He took it himself. He said, "Where are we going?" She said, "West Road, McKinley, pleurisy in the wife." 2 miles, he said. 2 miles is a fine walk. He walked with her. He carried the bag the 2 miles out and the 2 miles back. He did not speak much. He listened when she talked. He set the bag down on the floor of the McKinley parlor while she worked. He picked it up again when she was finished. He carried it the 2 miles home. The next morning the bag was at the door before she was. The next morning he was at the porch with his hat in his hand. He said, "Where today?" She said, "South. New house. Birth 3rd trimester check." He said, "South it is." He carried the bag. On the 4th morning, when Hannah Cole came out onto the porch in her coat with the bag in her own hand, Silas Greer was sitting on the porch step. He stood up. He said, "Hannah." She said, "Silas, I have it this morning. I would not have you make a habit of a thing that is mine to do." He looked at her. He did not move toward the bag. He said, "Hannah, I will not take it from you if you do not want me to. I will only ask you a question. I will ask the question once, and then I will not ask it again. And the answer you give will be the answer I keep." She said, "Ask Silas." He said, "Has any soul in this town carried that bag for you in the 4 years you have been carrying it?" She said, "No." He said, "Has any soul in Helena?" "No." "Has any soul, since the year you set up the practice in Helena, walked beside you on a call and held the bag while you sat with the patient?" "No." "You have walked 3,000 miles alone with that bag?" "I have." he said. "Then will you allow me to walk one with you? Just the one. I will not ask for the second. I will not ask for the third. I will ask for one. And if you say no to the one, I will sit down on this porch and wait for you to come back, and I will not raise the matter again." She looked at him. She held the bag in her own hand. She looked at the bag. She looked at his hand open at his side. She looked at his face. She said, "Silas Greer, you may walk one with me today, and tomorrow we will see about the second." He said, "That is more than I asked. I will take the one, Hannah." She handed him the bag. He took it. He set the strap on his own shoulder. He walked beside her down the road. By the end of that week, the small leather strap of Hannah Cole's medicine bag had begun, for the first time in 4 years, to wear a dark line into the wool of another shoulder. The dark line on Hannah's own shoulder did not vanish. It would never vanish. The line had been worn in deep, but the line stopped being the only line. That was the small thing. That was the second promise. The promise had not been said. The promise had been carried. On the morning of the 4th day, when Ruth Cole was strong enough to sit up against the pillow but not yet strong enough to leave the bed, the child asked Silas Greer to teach her the name of every plant on the second shelf of her mother's cupboard. The child had been looking at the cupboard from the bedroom door for 2 days. The cupboard sat in the corner of the kitchen. It was a tall, narrow cupboard her father had built for her mother in the year Ruth had been born. The cupboard had 2 shelves below and 2 shelves above. The 2 shelves below held the dishes. The 2 shelves above held the small brown paper twists and the small glass jars and the small clay pots that were the working library of her mother's practice. There were 44 plants by Ruth's count on the second shelf. She had been counting them since she was 4. She had asked her mother to teach her the names by name for the last 2 years. Her mother had taught her some. Her mother had not finished. There had not been time. The cupboard had been a working cupboard, not a teaching cupboard. But Silas Greer, sitting on the floor beside the bed with his back against the wall on the morning of the 4th day, had said, "Child, what are you looking at when you look at that cupboard?" The child had said, "The second shelf, sir." He had said, "What is on the second shelf?" 4 little brown twists and 7 little glass jars and 3 little clay pots. "Do you know what is in them?" "I know what is in some of them, sir. Mama has taught me some. She has not finished. Would you like, while you are in this bed, to be taught the rest?" The child had looked at him. The child had said, "Yes, sir." He had stood up. He had gone to the cupboard. He had taken down the second shelf, twist by twist, and jar by jar, and pot by pot, and he had laid each one on a clean square of linen on the kitchen table, and he had brought them, 3 at a time, into the bedroom on a wooden tray, and he had set the tray on the bed beside the small body of Ruth Cole, and he had named them: yarrow leaf, willow bark, golden seal root, comfrey leaf, witch hazel bark, slippery elm bark, mullein leaf, lobelia, skullcap, valerian root, boneset, dandelion root, burdock root, chamomile, black cohosh root, blue cohosh root, pennyroyal, marshmallow root, echinacea root, plantain leaf, nettle leaf, red raspberry leaf, mugwort, catnip leaf, hyssop leaf, coltsfoot, horehound, elecampane root, lovage, vervain, yellow dock root, cleavers, self-heal, lemon balm, sage leaf, thyme leaf, rosemary leaf, tansy wormwood, feverfew, angelica root, lobelia again because Hannah had 2 twists of it for different uses, arnica flower, sassafras root bark. He named them. He named each one in his own slow voice. He said with each name the use his own mother had taught him in the Cooperage cabin in Fairleigh, Vermont, in the summers of his boyhood. His own mother had been a healer, too. He had not, in 15 years, named the plants aloud to any person. He had not, for that matter, named them aloud to himself in a long while. Ruth Cole did not interrupt. She listened. She held each small twist in turn between her finger and her thumb. She smelled some of them. She did not smell others because Silas had said, "Child, do not smell that one. Smelling it is the use of it. We are saving the use of it for when you have a need." Hannah Cole stood in the doorway of the bedroom the whole time. She had her left hand on the frame of the door. She had her right hand against her own throat. She did not move for the better part of an hour. When Silas was finished, he set the wooden tray on the bedside table. He helped the child lie back down. He sat back down on the floor beside the bed. He said, "Child, you have had your first lesson in the second shelf. There will be a lesson in the third shelf when you are well enough to sit at the table. Would you like that?" The child said, "Yes, sir." He said, "I will teach you. Your mama will teach you. We will both teach you. Will that suit?" The child said, "It will suit, Mr. Greer." She closed her eyes. She slept. Silas Greer turned his head. He saw Hannah Cole in the doorway. He saw her hand against her own throat. He saw the wet on her face. He did not say anything to her about it. He stood up off the floor. He picked up the wooden tray. He carried it back to the kitchen. He began, twist by twist and jar by jar and pot by pot, to put the second shelf of the cupboard back together. Hannah Cole came into the kitchen behind him. She did not say anything. She stood beside him at the cupboard. She handed him the twists in order. He set them on the shelf in order. They did not speak through the entire small work. When the shelf was done, he closed the cupboard door. He turned to her. She said low, "Silas, my mother taught me the names of the plants by the kitchen window in the cabin in Iowa when I was 8. I have been waiting for 6 years to teach them to her. I have not had the hour," he said. "Hannah, you have a great many hours behind you that you have not had. You will have a great many hours ahead of you that you will. There are 2 shelves in the cupboard. You will teach her the third. I will teach her the second. We will both, if you allow it, teach her the work that follows from the shelves. The work that follows from the shelves is the work that will keep this child fed in the years after we are gone. It is the work your mother put in your hand and the work my mother put in mine. We will, between us, put it in her too." She did not say anything for a long second. Then she said, "Silas." Yes, he did not say her name. He set his right hand on the kitchen table between them. He left it there. She looked at it. She did not put her own hand on his. Not yet. The third promise had been spoken in the act of naming the plants. The fourth promise was waiting on a different table on a different night. But she looked, slow and steady, at the hand on the table. She thought, for the first time in 2 years and 2 months, about a man's hand at a kitchen table that was not the hand of her husband, John Cole. She did not feel guilt. She thought she might. She had thought she would for 2 years. She did not. She felt instead the long, simple relief of having found, after a long time alone, a second hand to lay her own work into when the work was too much for the one. She turned away from the table. She went to put the kettle on. The kettle was already on. She picked it up anyway. She set it back down. She turned. She said, "Silas, will you sit at the table for dinner tonight?" He said, "I will, Hannah." That night, for the first time in 3,000 miles, Hannah Cole did not sit at her kitchen table alone after Ruth had gone to bed. The third promise had been kept. The fourth promise was spoken at the same kitchen table. On the 7th evening, after the child had been put to bed, with the rain coming down soft against the tin roof and the lantern on the table burning low, Hannah had been baking that evening. The cabins smelled of yeast and the molasses she had stirred into the dough for the children of the McKinley cabin she would visit in the morning. Silas had been mending. He had a tear in the cuff of his own shirt that he had been meaning to fix for a month. He had asked her for a needle and a length of dark thread. She had given him the small sewing box that had been her mother's. He sewed at the kitchen table while she pulled the bread from the iron stove and set the 4 loaves to cool on the windowsill. Neither of them spoke for the better part of half an hour. The silence was the kind of silence that, in a kitchen where 2 people are working, becomes a third presence at the table. He set the needle down. He held the cuff up to the lantern. The mend was small and tight. It would hold for a year. He set the cuff down. He folded the shirt. He said low, "Hannah." She said, "Silas." He said, "I am going back up the ridge in the morning." She did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I know." He said, "I have been here 7 days. The child is well, the bag has been carried, the cupboard has been named, the kitchen table has been sat at. I have done the thing I came down to do. I will not stay past that thing without your saying so." She said, "I know that too." He said, "I would not have you ask me to stay because you do not know how to put me out. I would have you ask me to stay because you would have me, eh?" She said, "Silas." He said, "Hannah." She said, "Sit down." He sat down. He set his hands flat on the kitchen table on either side of the folded shirt. She sat down across from him. She set her hands flat on the table, too. The 4 hands, 2 of them his and 2 of them hers, lay on the wood of the table between them. The lantern between the hands made the small, wide circle of yellow that meant in any frontier kitchen the inside of a conversation. She said, "Silas, I would have you stay. Not tonight. I would have you go up the ridge in the morning. I would have you, while you are there, ride down on Sunday. I would have you on Sunday sit at this table for the noon meal. I would have you bring with you, in your saddlebag, a single change of clothes. I would have you, after the noon meal, walk with me and Ruth out to the small garden at the side of the cabin and show Ruth the small plot of soil at the back of the south wall that has the best sun. I would have you tell us, between the 3 of us, what we might plant there in the spring." He nodded. She said, "I would have you, when the supper bell rings in the evening, sit down again at this table. I would have you eat with us. I would have you, after the supper, put on your boots and your coat, and step out the door, and ride back up the ridge to the cabin. I would have you do this every Sunday between the end of November and the 1st of March. She paused. She said, "I would have you, on the 1st of March, ride down for the last time. Not because you would not come up the ridge again, because we would not come down. I would have you take us up the ridge with you that day. I would have you marry me before God on the porch of your cabin in the spring sun. I would have you not ask me, in any year of the rest of my life, whether the bag is mine to carry alone. I would have you assume, as I would have you assume the rain belongs to no one, that the bag is also yours to carry, on the days I would have your hand on it." He looked at her for a long second. He did not move. He said, "Hannah." She said, "Silas." He said, "I have not in 15 years sat across a kitchen table from a woman who has set down a thing on the table without asking my leave to set it down. The setting down is the gift, Hannah. The gift is in the unasked. I will take it." He stood up. He came around the table. He knelt slow at her side. He set his hand, careful, on top of her hand on the kitchen table. He said, "I will come down on Sunday at noon. I will bring the single change of clothes. I will not say a word about the rest of it tonight. I will say one word about the rest of it on the 1st of March. The word I will say on the 1st of March will be yes. The word you said tonight was yes. I will not, for the rest of my time on this ridge, undo your yes by being slow with my own." She did not say anything for a long second. She turned her hand under his. She held his hand on the kitchen table. The lantern on the table ticked over once. That was the 4th promise. It had been spoken in plain words. It had been sealed at the kitchen table with the small fold of the 4 hands. He stood. He kissed the top of her head, slow, like a man who had not kissed any woman's head in a very long time. He picked up his shirt. He went to the small frame in the corner of the kitchen where his wool mattress lay. He banked the stove. She blew out the lantern. The cabin was dark. The rain on the tin roof slowed and stopped. The kettle on the back of the stove gave its small last hiss of steam. The 2 of them slept on different mattresses on different floors of the same small cabin on the north end of Cedar Falls. In the morning he rode back up the ridge. He came down on Sunday. He brought the single change of clothes. He sat at the kitchen table for the noon meal. He walked with Hannah and Ruth out to the small garden at the side of the cabin. He stood with Ruth in the small plot of soil at the back of the south wall that had the best sun. He told the two of them what they might plant in the spring. He came down every Sunday between the end of November and the 1st of March. On the 1st of March he came down for the last time. He came down with the wagon. He helped them load the wagon. He helped them ride up the ridge. He married Hannah Cole on the porch of his cabin on the first Sunday in April, in the spring sun, with the small Reverend Lewis from the Methodist church in town, and Iris Marchand from the Post and Dry Goods, and Mr. and Mrs. McKinley from this West Road, and Ruth Cole in a small white dress, holding the wedding band on a cushion of folded green linen. The Reverend said the lines. Silas Greer said, "I will." Hannah Cole said, "I will." The small black dog at the porch step did not bark. The first crocuses at the south wall of the cabin were up. The Bitterroot Range to the east was still white at the top. That was the fourth promise, kept on the porch in the spring sun. The fifth was still to come. The fifth promise came on a Sunday in November of 1886, 8 months after the wedding, when Silas Greer and Hannah Greer rode down the South Road into the town of Cedar Falls for the morning service at the Methodist church. They had not been to the church together since the wedding. Hannah had been in her practice. Silas had been on the ridge. Ruth had been at school. The three of them had ridden down on Sundays for the church now and again, but they had ridden down separately, the way a busy family does in any frontier valley, with Hannah coming in on a Wednesday for a call and staying through the week, and Silas riding down on a Saturday to bring her up. But this Sunday they rode down together. Silas on the bay mare, Hannah on the small gelding she had ridden the night of the first knock, which Silas had given her on the morning of their wedding. Ruth on a small white pony Silas had bought her on her 7th birthday in May. The three of them rode down the road in the bright, cold November sun. The small Methodist church on the south end of Cedar Falls had been built in 1879 by a circuit rider from Spokane who had moved on a year later. The Reverend Lewis had taken the pulpit in 1881. He was a Welshman in his 60s who had served congregations in 3 towns before this one. He was a man who, by the count of every congregation he had served, had never preached a sermon longer than 34 minutes in his life. He preached, that Sunday morning, from the book of Ruth. He preached on the verse, "Whither thou goest, I will go." He preached on what it meant, in a frontier valley, for one person to say that line to another, out of free will and not out of duty. He did not, by any specific reference, name any person in the room, but every soul in the room knew which 2 souls he was speaking to. When the service ended, the Reverend Lewis stood at the door of the church, shaking hands as the congregation filed out. He shook the hand of Iris Marchand. He shook the hand of the mayor and Mrs. Higginbotham. He shook the hand of Dr. Hollingsworth, who had begun, in the last year, to attend the church, after a small private conversation he had had with Hannah Greer at the bedside of Iris Marchand's father, who had not lived through the winter despite both their hands. The Reverend shook the hands of the Greer family last, because they had sat in the last pew. He shook Silas's hand. He shook Hannah's hand. He shook Ruth's hand. He said, "Lo, Mr. Greer." Silas said, "Reverend." The Reverend said, "I had thought on the morning of your wedding in April that you might in time say a thing to this town from inside this church that you had said to me on the porch of your cabin. I had thought that the saying of it would mean a good deal to the town. I would not, of course, ask you to say it. I would only say that I had thought it." Silas Greer looked at the Reverend. He looked at his wife. He looked at the child between them. He looked back at the Reverend. He said, "Reverend, I will say it. If you will give me the back of the pulpit for 2 minutes," the Reverend said, "I will give you the back of the pulpit for 2 hours, Mr. Greer, if you have 2 hours of it in you." Silas Greer walked the length of the church up the center aisle. The congregation, which had been about to leave, did not leave. They turned. They watched. He climbed the 3 steps to the pulpit. He set his hands on either side of it. He looked out at the room. He said, Iris Marchand. I have come to retire the line about the Queen of England a second time. The first time I came in November of last year, and I told you alone. You have fairly told everyone in this town what I said to you. I would have you know that I am here this morning to say it to them in their own ears, so the line will not have to live another winter in any kitchen in this valley. He paused. He looked at his wife. He said, I refused 11 women in this county between the years of 1879 and 1883. I have been asked many times in many ways why. I have not given the answer to any soul in this valley. I will give it now, because the woman beside whom I now sit will not, I think, mind hearing it, and because the boy and the girl I now have under my roof should not, in my view, grow up wondering. He looked down at his hands on the pulpit. He said, I refused those 11 women because not one of them came up the South Road for any reason other than to look at me. The 11 women were good women. I have nothing in my mouth against any one of them. But none of them came up the road because they had nowhere else to walk to. None of them came up the road because the doctor in this town was at a card game in Lewiston, and a small girl was running a fever of 103. None of them came up the road because they had been carrying a bag for 4 years and had run out of road to carry it on. They came up the road because they had been told by their kin or by their friends or by the women of this valley that there was a man up there who needed a wife and that the wife might as well be them. They had come for the man, they had not come for themselves. He paused. He said, Hannah Cole came up the South Road in October of last year at 2:30 in the morning with a lantern in her hand and a bag on her shoulder. She did not come for me. She came for her daughter. The first words of her mouth at my door were her own daughter's name. The last words out of her mouth before she said good night to me on her porch 19 days later were her own daughter's name. She did not in any of the 19 days ask me for anything other than the help of my hands at her child's bedside. He paused. He said, I learned from those 19 days the answer to the question I had not let myself ask for 15 years. The question was whether a woman could come into my house and ask me for nothing. The answer was that she could. The answer was that if I had ever met a woman who could, I would not have refused her. He paused. He said, I did not refuse Hannah Cole. I came down with her on the first ride. I stayed at her table for 7 days. I came down to her every Sunday between November and March. I asked her on the first day of March to come up the ridge with me as my wife. She said yes. She said yes because I had not, in the 19 days or in the 4 months of Sundays, ever asked her to be less than the woman who had carried the bag for 4 years alone. The yes she said was a yes. She could only have said to a man who had not made her smaller in his house. I did not make her smaller. I did not, because I had spent 15 years learning, in my own slow way, that the only kind of marriage worth having is the marriage in which neither person is made smaller. I had learned that lesson too late to give it to Catherine Pratt, who was my first wife, and who left me in 1869 with a note on the kitchen table, and who was right to leave. He paused. He said, I will say one more thing, then I will sit down. I will say it to the women of this town who are listening. He looked out at the pews. He looked at Iris Marchand. He looked at the wife of the mayor. He looked at the 11 faces in the pews of women who had once been a parlor where his name had been a small evening joke. He said, There will be a woman in this valley in your time or in your daughter's who will walk up another road in another season for another reason. She will not come up because she has been sent. She will come up because she has run out of road. If you are at the door of that house, and you have the door in your hand, I would have you open it. I would have you not ask her name before you open. I would have you not ask her business before you open. I would have you open the door and stand back and let her in. I would have you let her ask you for the thing she has come to ask for. Open the door. That is the line I would have you remember from this valley. Open the door. He stopped. He looked down at his hands on the pulpit. He had not spoken this many words in any room in 9 years. The church was quiet. Then Hannah Greer stood up at the back of the church. She did not say anything. She walked slow, the length of the center aisle of the church. She came up to the pulpit. She stood at the bottom of the 3 steps. She held up her hand to her husband. He came down. He took her hand at the bottom of the steps. He stood with her in the aisle. Ruth Greer, who had been Ruth Cole, walked up the aisle with her white pony's reins and still in the hand she had not taken them out of in the back pew, because she had not wanted to set them down. She stopped at the side of her mother. She took her mother's other hand. She did not say anything either. The 3 of them stood in the aisle. The Reverend Lewis, at the door of the church, lifted his Bible against his chest. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Iris Marchand stood up. She walked slow from her pew to the aisle. She did not, by any custom of the church, have any business in the aisle. She stood at the end of the pew. She held out her hand. She said, "Hannah Greer, I would carry your bag on the way to the dry goods this Thursday. I would if you would let me." Hannah Greer looked at her. She did not say anything for a long second. She said, "Iris, I would let you." Iris Marchand nodded. She did not cry. Iris Marchand had not been seen to cry in the town of Cedar Falls in 9 years. She nodded once. She sat back down. The Greer family walked down the center aisle of the church. They walked out the front door into the bright, cold November sun. They mounted the bay mare and the small gelding and the small white pony. They rode together up the south road to the cabin on the ridge. The lantern in the window of the cabin was lit. Silas had lit it that morning before they had ridden down. He had wanted. When his wife and his daughter came up the road behind him for the noon meal, for the light to be there waiting for them. He had lit a lantern in his cabin window every morning of the 7 months since the wedding, for the same reason. He would, for the rest of his time on the ridge, light it every morning of every Sunday. There were 8 Sundays in a winter on the south ridge above Cedar Falls. There were 37 Sundays in the year that followed November of 1886. There were 612 Sundays in the 18 years of the Greer marriage that followed before Silas Greer was laid in the ground in the small Methodist cemetery beside his wife's first husband, John Cole, whose body had been moved at Hannah's quiet request from Helena, Montana, in the second spring of the marriage, because, she had said, there was room in the cemetery, and there was no good reason for a kind man to lie alone in a city he had not chosen. Hannah Greer lived another 16 years. She caught 174 babies in her practice in Cedar Falls. She trained Ruth Greer as her successor. Ruth Greer took the practice over in 1898 and ran it for the next 41 years. The bag on Ruth's shoulder when she carried it was the bag her mother had carried for 34 years before her. Iris Marchand carried the bag, the first time on the Thursday after the November service. She carried it 11 times more in the 8 years she had left in her own life. She died in 1894 of an aneurysm at the back of her own counter. The last thing she said to the friend who was with her was, "Tell Hannah I left her the bag at the door." That is the story of Silas Greer and Hannah Cole and the cabin on the South Ridge above Cedar Falls. The line about the Queen of England was retired. The door, by the count of 3 generations of women in that valley, kept being opened. The lantern in the window of the cabin on the South Ridge, by the time Ruth Greer was an old woman herself, had been lit by 4 different women in 4 different decades. None of them had ever needed to be asked to light it. That is the end of the story.